So I guess one of the things that being faculty in residence at the Emerging Media Lab reinforces is thinking about emerging media and what it means. And so I have kind of this two sides of the coin where I'm interested in the technology and I'm interested in the law. And I'm going to keep the law very rudimentary in today's talk because I know I'm not speaking to a legal audience, but the slides will be available. And I may skip through some of the heavier legal going, but I am going to talk about legal principles. The two sides of the coin are really what this talk is about, because I'm going to take you through the evolution of my thinking in this area generally, and it's going to be all about how we can change the law. And at the end, it will become something really, really different, where I stop talking about changing the law and I start talking about something that is going to sound very, very strange. And it's a reversal of our traditional concepts of law, but it fits much better with emerging media. So I don't know that anyone has ever seen this movie or heard about it. It was directed by David Lean in the early 50s, and it's called Breaking the Sound Barrier. And in the movie, the pilot who breaks the sound barrier, at the moment of extreme danger, when his plane is about to blow apart, does something completely counterintuitive. He reverses the thrust and sails through the sound barrier, which is completely ridiculous and nothing like what actually happened, because Chuck Yeager, not a British pilot, broke the sound barrier and he didn't reverse thrust. But interestingly, by the end of this, I'm going to be reversing thrust. So you are entitled to be skeptical for that reason, and I want you to be. You're my colleagues, and I'm going to be talking about things that are very difficult, and doesn't mean that I'm necessarily right. So that's what colleagues are for. So over the years, I've done a couple of papers, a couple of presentations from 2016 to 2018, kind of one big one a year in the UK. And what ultimately they've done is, I argued that what's missing in the law, in the first one in 2016, because of the lapses of copyright and the inadequacies of copyright, is a right to create, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the following year, I centered on freedom of thought, a very little used concept in law, but one that exists in our constitutional structure, exists in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but has not really been amplified in any way for 100 years. So again, I kind of dredge up a legal concept. First, I create a legal concept in right to create, which is different from freedom of expression, although related to it. Then I dredge up an old legal concept that's kind of devoid of very much that's useful in the 21st century and say we need to activate it because of where emerging media is going. And then finally, in 2018, I come to what I think is a solution to all the problems, which is we all have data, and that data actually belongs to us. And the easiest way to deal with that is to, a little bit kind of the inverse of the top one, let's create a copyright, or let's declare that we have a copyright in our own data. And that way we can best protect ourselves from all the crazy things that are happening in the digital world that put our individualness and our individual integrity at stake. And then, today, for the first time, I'm going to kind of reveal what the next step is. And it really is a reversal of thrusters, where I look at AI, I look at artificial intelligence, and I basically say, is this as bad as we think it is? Or might this actually be good? So yeah, I'm unfortunately 2016 to 2018 in a rather dark place, so I will be marking the years with people who passed in that year. But I started rather angrily with mods. Grand Prix Legends was a game that came out in 1997 and was unfinished by any standard. About 25% finished, and it was released, and it was pulled off the shelves within weeks. But it had one particular feature that was really interesting to people who liked racing games. And that is that it was the first computer game, the first game of any kind, that didn't have the cars turning on an imaginary pivot point that's at the center of the car, but actually had physics built into 4 patches representing the tires and did that calculation in real time. So it was ultra realistic, and for that reason, everybody wanted it to work. And I won't get into the details of how badly it worked, but let's just say that the original PC Gamer review, which you will not find online anymore, was something like a 55 or a 60, because it didn't work at all. The reason you can't find that review online, I would argue, is not because PC Gamer has lost it, but because of subsequent things that happened that made this rank in the top 100 games of all time. So what happened? What happened was a community grew around this game and fixed everything that was wrong, improved it beyond any expectations, and the game basically came off of no Sim Racer's hard drive probably until 2009. It didn't come off of mine until 2012. Made multiplayer work, built great graphics for it. It was an amazing game, and it was all done by the community, which creates an interesting conundrum. When the community puts more hours of development into a product, who does the product belong to? Who should, in fairness, the product belong to? Copyright is based on this notion of labor. There were 500 tracks. There were textures for all the cars. There was rebuilt AI. There was rebuilt multiplayer. There's no doubt that if you cumulated the community hours versus the developer hours would be dwarfed. But the way copyright law works, the first one in gets the copyright and gets all the derivative rights. Now, what happened here is a bit unusual because the developers were on to other games and they didn't want their game to forever be thought of as a 62 or a 55. They never gave the community permission, but they definitely had a nudge, nudge, wink, wink communication with the higher ranking members of the community. So I think it's safe to assume that nobody thought they were going to be sued for this. There was a lawsuit later on. But that kind of showed the soft underbelly of copyright law when faced with a community that was building off of something that already existed and had a copyright. There are many revealing contradictions in copyright law, but I'll just sort of give you highlights of what I was thinking about in 2016. The first obvious one is in this digital age, and you guys, I mean, at the Emerging Media Lab, you're proof of this. Nobody can do this stuff alone. There isn't one creator. There's collaborative creation. That's how we do things in digital media. That's how we do most creation these days. But certainly in digital media, all the modalities are collaborative. And collaborative doesn't work really well with the law. So this is a case that involves Sarah McLachlan in 2000. And I can show you digital cases, but this is one that's close to home, where as often happens, when you're in studio, I think this had to do with the album Surfacing. There was a person in studio who helped quite a lot in the album and in one of the songs in particular, and felt that he should have a co-author credit on that song, and sued. And the court, after carefully considering copyright law and not being wrong about copyright law, said, well, the only way it really works where you can have co-authorship is if both parties intended co-authorship. So if Sarah McLachlan intended him to be a co-author, he could be a co-author, but what he intended didn't matter unless she agreed. So co-authorship becomes a negotiation. Which again, those of you who work in the digital sphere and who are at the Emerging Media Lab, you're all talking to each other all the time. You're helping each other all the time. So this is kind of, the law is not fitting in very well because the law, traces back, sorry about that. The law traces back to 1709, when copyright was for sole authors who wrote solely a book or a piece of music. It certainly never envisioned the digital age. So just didn't fit. The other problem, I'm only going to do 3. Another problem is that we're treating digital, I don't know if anybody knows who this is, but this is someone who was an activist and got charged with uploading free journals to the open internet and committed suicide before his trial. So it was truly tragic on every level, and yet the US Attorney General, when he was charged, had this quote, which I won't put it on me, I'll say professors at Harvard Law School don't think is a very strong statement of the law. Stealing is stealing, whether you use a computer command or a crowbar. It's not exactly the same. And whether you take documents, data, or dollars, not exactly the same either. Data is replicable, dollars are not. It is equally harmful to the victim whether you sell what you have stolen or give it away. Again, it's kind of a strange concept. That this appeared in a press release from the Attorney General office in Massachusetts sort of tells you how off the mark we have been in the past. And a third problem is this really weird double standard that when I explain to you, you'll recognize. But we don't think about it and we don't talk about it very much. But you're all technologists, so you have some understanding of how copyright works and you have some understanding of how patents work. The thing about copyright is once something is copyrighted, which happens automatically, you have this huge parcel of rights over anything that is technically derivative from the original work. And it belongs to whoever the copyright holder is. And you have that for actually a very long period of time as things have evolved. In patent law, you get the same thing. You get a license to use what you've created. But you have to put it on the public record so everyone can see what you've created. And if someone wants to change it, can change it enough for it to be a new thing, then they can get a new patent. Not after your patent is expired, but like right away. So think about that. Let's use modding, very simple, modding in video games. When you mod, if you were doing that in a patent context, modding would not only be allowed, it would be rewarded. But when you do it in a copyright context, it's a very dangerous thing to do. So there's this really strange difference, which some explain, Rebecca Tushnet at Harvard, and others explain in the context of, well, patents is all about businesses and rich people and the privileged. And really anybody can have a copyright. So there's a bias in favor of patents. Interesting. So that's, patent law allows free riding, copyright doesn't. So where I got to in all of that was, think of it as a right to mod. I called for the creation of a right on the part of people who work on other people's stuff, but make it better. Think about Grand Prix Legends, improve it so that they have something, whether you think of it as co-authorship or otherwise. So, and ultimately the question is, isn't creativity more important to our society than property? And if we really want innovation, which we say we want, don't we need to do that? So that was all good up to that point. And I used some, as I would, legal concepts. This is a great paper which explains why games, not video games, but why games, pure games, are not copyrightable, and does a very extensive legal analysis. And the reason Bruce Boyden says games are not copyrightable is because basically games are nothing without the gamer. Games are empty shells waiting to be filled. They're like a spreadsheet. They mean nothing without whatever you put into the spreadsheet. Games are systems, and systems are not copyrightable in exactly the same way. A game as sold is only a game form. The content necessary for an instance of the game comes from the players. So again, you can see the analogy. Grand Prix Legends is completely unplayable. The community makes it playable. It was nothing without the community, so don't they deserve something? The game itself is supplied by the players. Systems are shells into which users pour meaning. So the other kind of part of this is, or the core of this is the user as creator. which is very much a meme of the digital age. That's really what's changed in digital, that the means of creative production don't belong only to a television station. Really anybody can do it, and with the internet, which is digital of course, anyone can have access, anyone can publish. And if you look at post-structuralist theory, and I know everybody's gonna start breathing hard if I talk about it a little bit too much, you find that that's also consistent with revising copyright in the way I'm suggesting. Because post-structuralism has always said that the reader is as important as the writer. Because it's the reader who infuses the meaning, and no two readers will see it the same way, and very often the reader will understand things totally different from what the author does, and the author should have no more authority than anyone else. If you're a gamer and you play Minecraft, one of the things that Notch, who developed Minecraft, says is that he never ever imagined the uses to which Minecraft would be put to. And he couldn't, even as author. And if you say the only legitimate interpretation belongs to the author, you obviously get into an intellectually incorrect place. So all of this is consistent if you say the modder or the gamer is as important as the developer. I will just blithely skip through. If you're interested in post-structuralism, you can read this stuff and see how it applies to gaming. A simple way is just to think about playing a card game. How important is the game designer? How important are you? And how important are the other people playing the game? If you look at that objectively and intellectually honestly, I think you get basically here. Now Minecraft, because of Notch, he's kept it very open for that reason. He understood what his role was, and he understood what everybody else's role was in creating Minecraft. And this is, of course, analogous to Facebook. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg isn't making the content for Facebook. We are. Well, not me, I quit. But others are. And they're the ones inhabiting the spaces. And you see the same thing in a gaming context. So 2017, sorry, this is one of my favorite shows when I was a kid. We got to a place where virtual reality headsets had been around. And even in those early headsets, there was something really weird. And those of you who tried even the first generation ones know what I'm talking about. That even though it was pixelated, even though your brain knew that you were wearing a headset, your body didn't. So that if you were at the edge of a precipice, you got scared, or if a monster jumped out at you. I remember the first time I tried it, there was a sort of a video game monster that leapt at me. I just completely cowered. I intellectually knew exactly what was going on. And I intellectually knew that this wasn't real, but it was visceral. It was my body doing it, not my mind. So virtual reality, even in that simple form, was pretty powerful. And you could project forward and realize that it was going to become more and more powerful. You know, and I'm not saying this is the greatest movie. I enjoyed it. But if you haven't had virtual reality experience, it's not a bad place to start. But a very simple place is this patent out of Korea, which is actually distinctly non-digital in every material particular. They knew the turtles go towards the light, and to control the turtle, they created a light field around the turtle so that you could control the turtle's movements, make it turn left or right, by controlling where the space in the light field was. We're not that different. And this is ultimately where we'll be going here, if you know everything there is to know about me, and you analyze it properly, you can make me do some things that maybe I don't even want to do. And of course, the advertising industry is really interested in that. They got interested in VR right away. An even more powerful tool. And an entirely new way to think about advertising. So I hope you feel comforted by that. There will be no escaping ads in VR. All of which reminds me of this. Has anyone been in one of these elevators downtown? Here's how it works. You know the old elevators, you walk in and you press your floor? Not anymore. You go to a station, you are asked what floor you want to go to, and it tells you what elevator to get into. You go to that elevator, and it takes you to the floor. And you have this weird, captured feeling. Yes, it's incredibly efficient, but there's this odd, I don't know if Saeed agrees, but this odd feeling of not being in control. Because you can't just press a button and say, I want to get off here, which you would never do anyways. But the absence of that control feels extremely odd. Technology wants to do that. It can be invasive, and what looks good on paper doesn't necessarily accord with our own feelings. Now, I think there are some good uses to this. This is certainly one I don't object to, but multiply it 1,000 times, and I think you're where we are at now. Netflix came up with House of Cards by analyzing its data from all the shows that it was putting up and seeing who is the star people most want to watch, what kind of show people really like. Political dramas were hot at the time, et cetera, et cetera. And in a reversal of the usual system, which is you go to a bunch of producers and say, what do you have? And then you say, well, I think that'll fit for us, or I don't think that'll fit. They went to the producers and said, this is what we want. Tell us how you're going to do this show. And they were right. And Kevin Spacey was extremely popular at the time on the Netflix movies that they were showing. So they said, we want Kevin Spacey. They might not feel the same way today, but that's different. And we know that there's a science to addiction, and that most video game companies, especially in the freemium kind of app space, employ psychologists to figure out how to keep you doing microtransactions. We know what Facebook does now more than ever. And so to an extent, we've become the platform. And there's lots of scary science to come. I make a big deal of showing these are responsible sources. This is the scariest. MIT News, neuroscientists plant false memories in the brain. This is real. This is not the National Enquirer. And this Frank Pasquale, who's a great academic, makes a very wonderful and subtle point. There is a delicate balance between appropriating new technologies, using them, enjoying them, and being appropriated by them. And this goes, right now we can go, we're worried about addiction in video games, and that's legitimate. Or we're worried about digital addiction. But what if no one has an idea, most of all you, that you are addicted? Or that bad things are happening? And our vulnerability comes from the fact that we're giving up all sorts of information about ourselves all the time. And that yields massive data. And you'll notice I haven't even really talked about AI yet. So we are vulnerable because of the amount of information we give up in the emerging media world. And I would say for one other reason. And that is we are particularly susceptible to VR. For a couple of reasons. One, there is this belief that the world already is a game. And it's actually based on some academic work that says clearly we are moving towards a future where we will be able to create total simulations of a total world, and that's predictable. So we either are in one of those worlds, or there's like a 40% chance, or there's like a 40% chance that, 30% chance that we're the first ones to have it, and we'll be the ones making the virtual worlds. Not in our lifetime, but a couple of lifetimes away. So when you kind of work through the math, it's a little scary. Either scarier or significantly less scary, but still very important, is this. Is this a video game? Creating a model of the world using multiple feedback loops and various parameters in order to accomplish a goal. If you read it pretty quickly, it is a passable definition of a video game. It's actually the definition of consciousness by the leading kind of brain scholar in the world today. And so at the very least, how we're conscious and how we exist in a gamified environment is profoundly aligned. So we're very susceptible. Given the worldwide popularity of gaming, obviously, it's becoming the biggest real business around. We are very, very aligned with playing games. This is students at literally 2:30 in the morning. I was preparing a lecture and I walked by students playing FIFA at 2:30 in the morning. The issue is, do we lose ourselves? Can we lose ourselves? And I'm not going to spend too much time on post-structuralism, but basically post-structuralism, again, is that you as the reader of the world, your view of it is entirely valid. So it really encourages and reinforces the value of human agency, of your own individualism, your own choice, your own creativity. Technology, on the other hand, is a language. It's pretty structuralist. You could think we have choices, but if you really know how technology is built, or if you're a coder, you understand it as language that directs you and in fact structures you in many ways and restricts you. And this is kind of my favorite picture illustrating that, because I don't need words. From a legal perspective, I don't think it's very hard to say the law should intervene when we lose ourselves, whether we know it or not. The law should be able, when we've lost our human agency, when we become zombies, the law needs to step in. The rule of law needs to step in and say, enough, we're not going to let that happen. look, we've had these issues before, subliminal advertising, we look at privacy law, we think about consumer protection law, we have a bunch of legal means at our disposal. The European Union is even prepared to wonder whether virtual reality should be considered a drug. That's real. That's not, none of this is made up. We could, borrowing a page from the EU, say there should be a mandatory right to be forgotten for brain data. We could say, hey, we have contracts with all these companies, so they have to be in good faith. We might be able to say that Microsoft and Facebook and YouTube and Google are trustees of our data. I won't get into that argument. It's a complex legal argument, but it's doable. And it's what a Harvard law professor by the name of Jonathan Zittrain and a Yale law professor by the name of Jack Balkin essentially argue for. This notion of the court saying, no, Facebook is a trustee of your data, and if they misuse it, they're liable to you. Now, we haven't really seen that happen, but these arguments exist. And this is where freedom of thought comes in. If you're being zombified, you should, maybe that's what freedom of thought in the Charter and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Freedom of thought sounds like a very useful concept. Whatever it was intended to mean 125 years ago, which I'm not sure people could really figure out. It was kind of related to free expression or freedom of religion, which are now separate rights. In a world where you can become a zombie, in effect, freedom of thought sounds like a good right to have. So when are we not in control? The one thing the law has, but which is surprisingly not useful, is literally zombie cases. They're called automaton cases. They are when people lose control of themselves and murder someone or stab someone, but it's not really them doing it. They're sleepwalking or, and these are things that, come up as legitimate defenses, but the tests underlying them are very, very old and just aren't terribly coherent. So I kind of did my own version. If we were going to write a law, the law should intervene where data was obtained without fully informed consent. So think of it as medical level consent. And that individual's freedom of thought is impacted, causing a substantial risk of harm. So not for nothing. There's got to be something really significant. And freedom of thought is to be defined as personal autonomy and human dignity, and the ability to make choices on your own terms, not on someone else's terms, which is very much at risk in society. And I formulated that quite a while before this came out by a noted thinker in the area, Why Personal Agency Matters More Than Personal Data. So in other words, we need to allow ourselves to be human, and if we restrict data flows to do that, it's okay. So that takes us to 2018 and the loss of Stephen Hawking. That is, in my view, a glorious picture. And I want to go deeper into what freedom of thought means. Freedom of thought means that, again, in a post-structuralist sense, what I think of something and what you think of something of the same thing is different, because we each attribute personal meanings that arise only from us to something. So this is a wonderful story, in my view. We all have old, not all of us, but some of us who are gamers have old game boxes around, and this person found an old Xbox and realized that he is, in playing a racing game, that his recently deceased father's ghost car was still on the Xbox. Now this is the world we're coming into, right? Think about what technology does here. It's a 100% accurate version of what his father did when he was still alive. And of course, what the son did was he would race his father, and then if he was ahead of his father, he'd stop ahead of the finish line so he didn't erase the ghost car. There's a lot of meaning in that. There's a lot of juice in that. If you want a kind of more academic look at this, this is really important. Memory is personal knowledge, not personal awareness. Now that distinction may not initially register with you. Memory is not fluffy clouds. Memory is data. It's data in our brains. It's something that we can, and now you'll see where this goes, regard as proprietary. Now this is interesting. This game, we don't know when it's coming out, but it's from Will Wright, who did The Sims and is kind of an acknowledged genius in gaming. He is making a game that not only is going to be different, lots of games are slightly different for you and me, but he's going to be making a game about your memories and your memories only. So my version and Saeed's version are going to be very different. And everyone's version is going to be entirely individuated. So, using my own example, what if an algorithm knew all these things? My favorite type of movie, romantic comedy, my favorite stars, young John Cusack and Anna Kendrick, my favorite screenwriter, my favorite plot tropes, which happens to be time travel that teaches life lessons, and everything that I cry at, everything that I laugh at, my favorite music, my personality profile, my history, my personal history, and everything else about me. At that point, we can do something that is, Saeed and I can watch what seems to be the same movie, but his will have different stars, and mine will have different stars, and mine will have different music, and mine might have different cadence, and his may be a comedy, and mine may be a drama. Or mine may be a romantic comedy, and his may be a drama. Whatever it is, it will, and all of this is possible. First of all, remember that we're all different from one another. I mean, you will not find two people with the same apps on the same phone, I would venture to say, anywhere in the world, unless they just bought their phones within the last, week. And if you're wondering, this has in a way been done very crudely, and I would say very badly, and it's worth a good laugh. This was a movie prepared by the United States about, when was this? Oh, it doesn't show. A couple of months ago before the Trump Kim Jong-un summit, and it was directed only to one person, Kim Jong-un. And it was based on whatever they thought was his psychological profile or whatever they knew. And we don't know what they may have gathered through digital media or not, or whether they were just guessing. But it's worth watching to see what something produced just for one person looks like. The deeper point, and this is the analogy to kind of all the stuff that I've been doing over the years, is it's the same point. The audience is partially the creator. And if it's our brain data that's giving the information, how are we any less the creator? How are we any different from the modders of Grand Prix Legend? We're still providing what makes the thing work. And again, crude and may have worked, may not have worked, or worked, it certainly worked to a degree, a very dystopic example. But what Cambridge Analytica was doing with Facebook was trying to generate content for individuals based on their profiles to move them to a different political point of view or move them further along the political line that they already had. And they were doing that individually. It wasn't old media, we're going to buy an ad and show it to 50 million people and hope 3 million of them are swayed. It was, going very directly at it. Now, get into these. I'm going to give you a legal problem. This is kind of the hardest legal part, where I actually have to teach you a little bit of law that you may not know. But it comes from the standard dystopic trope that the corporation has taken over the world, whether there's political leaders somewhere in the background, the rule of law has disappeared, the corporation rules, and the political leaders, such as they are, if they exist at all, are in league with the corporation that's taken over the world. So, hasn't happened yet. We have some big corporations. But here's the problem with that. You think the Charter of Rights might apply, or the Constitution might apply, or your rights of freedom of expression, or your rights of privacy. They don't apply. Constitutional rights and charter rights apply to your relationship with the government, not with your relationship to Facebook and Google. Because guess what? And you know this as soon as I say it, corporations are people too. So corporations have rights against government. If they're interfered with too much, they use freedom of expression. They use all the rights that anyone else is entitled to. But we don't have rights we don't have constitutional protections against the companies or in respect of the entities that have the most to do with how we regulate our day-to-day life, which is digital. It's not the church anymore. It's not government anymore. Let's be real. It's our phones that regulate our day-to-day life. We have no constitutional rights against our phone. We have contracts. We have person-to-person contracts. And so if you're feeling a little trod upon by your telco or by Facebook, that's why. Your rights are restricted by contracts, and let's be honest, contracts that none of you read, and nor do I. So, sorry to use the meme, but my 16-year-old daughter said this is actually not a sexist meme, and I could use it. This is us. Those are the digital media companies, and there's the Constitution. We want constitutional rights. We think they're important, but we don't have them. We're married to the media companies. So, where are we? So this is where the worm starts turning for me, because what I've described is pretty negative, and here's where I start reversing thrusters a little bit. The first thing is the digital readout of our life is not us, for a bunch of reasons. This is a great piece by the person who was, until he died 2 years ago, the greatest living philosopher, Derek Parfit of Oxford. And he does a whole bunch of really convincing thought experiments about replicating you and showing that those replications of you are in fact not you. Parfit, of course, is nothing compared to my daughter, who says, no, the only thing the digital readouts have is what I want them to have. Now, that's not entirely true. We know that. unless she's turned everything off. But there's certainly some truth to that. And all you have to do is look at Instagram to see how people kind of organize what others see about their life. My old CEO, when I talked to him about the subject, pointed out something that you all know, and that is that algorithms don't look forward, they only look backwards. The data stops at the real moment in time. It can't really predict the future, and it can predict trends, but it can't actually do anything that's intuitive. So here's kind of the first place where the thrusters start really reversing. And that is, again, there's a little bit of post-structuralism underlying this. Gee, all of this is actually showing how complex an individual we are, as opposed to how sheepish and the same we are. Now that's not much at this stage, but that's not nothing either. There's a lot of stuff we don't understand about the world, and algorithms don't explain it. So the good news is we can't, in my view, simply be replaced by non-us. But the risk of manipulation is real. So I'm not denying that part. But where does that leave us legally? That leaves us with a clear field to say, no, we are conscious co-creators. We're not sheep. We're not all the same. We're not meaningless. In fact, the individual meanings of our lives are exactly what's being used and reflected back to us in this one-on-one digital world. If it was valueless, we'd be back in, we never would have moved off of broadcasting, where you were going from, a central tower and transmitter, the perfect word, to millions and millions of people who are all seeing exactly the same thing. That's not where we are today. So that must mean what we're feeding into the system not only has some value, but has substantial value. And of course, we can measure that if we needed to, by looking at how much these companies are making through advertising and other things. So what do we have to do? This is more for the lawyers. There is precedent to say, look, when you're faced with law that doesn't make sense, the proper course for the judge is to pass through them undeterred. In other words, just make it right. So where I ended up is co-authorship. We are co-authors in this digital world of the stuff that emanates or is reflected back from our data. And there's lots of ways of backing that up, theoretically or otherwise. So that's kind of a big run through. And now I want to talk about AI, and I want to get the thruster reversal to full. So yeah, 2019, this is a very old song. If you haven't heard it, give it a spin. But it does feel like the eve of destruction. And we've seen AI stuff go really, really bad. Microsoft's Tay, basically became racist in a day on Twitter. Robot with $100 in Bitcoin buys drugs. MIT scientists create a psychopath AI just by putting it on Reddit. And the robot got released by the Swiss police because I guess Swiss law didn't allow those actions to be attributed to the people who programmed the robot, who were doing it as an art project. So there was a defense. And then we've got these neat little legal issues about, hey, should bots have rights? And then we have the odd positive story, artificial intelligence to help us know fake news from real news. And all this happens because of big data, because of AI, because of machine learning. And I would argue that virtual reality, because of its visceral quality, based on what I said before, all fits in. And then Mary Meeker, who is with Kleiner Perkins and does an annual kind of readout of the digital world, said this in 2017. Perhaps interactive gaming, evolution, growth, usage with related data collection, analytics, real-time simulations, and engagement has been helping prepare society for the ongoing rise of human-computer interaction. So Mary Meeker is saying, hey, maybe all this digital stuff is really about the evolution of the human species. So I'm going to address that. Elon Musk, who people are listening to less these days, that's for sure, is a believer in the robot apocalypse, which for me is a good reason not to be. But he believes in it, and others do as well. So is it evolution, or are these going to be our masters? Or, kind of consistent with reverse thrusting, can AI technology that is already being used to individuate us enhance our human agency? Be our tool, not the tool of Facebook or others. Can it help protect our human agency? Can it help protect our privacy? Can it help protect our freedom of thought? Can it even help us with copyright? Could AI be a post-structuralist technology that reinforces these values of the human condition, of individualism, of choice, of creativity? So the thrust reversal is from AI as oppressor, from VR as oppressor, to a potential tool for individual liberation. I do not subscribe to the evolutionary theory of Mary Meeker, and I wouldn't put her as going as far as Ray Kurzweil. She was just asking a question. Kurzweil says, the singularity, we will merge with machines, and that is the next step in human evolution. The more I look at this, the more I think actually that our humanity is going to remain, and AI is going to be a tool. That our narrative will evolve through the tools, but not us. We'll grow, we'll change, we'll become better because we'll grow with the narrative. I don't know if anyone's read Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, but that is essentially the point that Pinker makes in a roundabout way. And his basic question was, why is there less crime, less murder, less bad things in the world than there used to be? His argument is the world is getting to be a better place. Why? And his answer is, if you read through it, it takes a while. His answer, as near as I can tell, is it's because we're talking to each other more. So that narrative can be very positive. Now, I don't want to dismiss the dangers. The dangers are, and I see it with my kids, the disconnection that comes from this. The vertical, not talking to each other, not communicating. So we've got to use these tools to create more and more peer-to-peer connections, because the vertical is very, very powerful. Might blockchain be a solution? I don't know. So this takes me to the last part. How is law going to change in this world that we've been talking about? What is law in this world that we're talking about? And for those of you, we're in Canada, so this is virtual reality AI, which I find interesting, spells the French word vrai. So what does AI do? What does technology, what does emerging media do to the rule of law? So here's my very quick law lesson, just a couple of slides. What you need to know about law. Law treats technologies as neutral. It doesn't believe technologies are good or bad. It believes people are good or bad. What people do with technologies may be good or bad, but not the technology itself. And law treats people, at least in theory, there's lots of pushback and rightly placed pushback about stratification in society and the rich and the poor and how the justice system doesn't treat them the same. But in theory, law treats everyone as equal. Kind of one last part of this, which I've thought about a lot over the years and is kind of inescapable. And that is that there's these strange parallels between what we think of as justice and emerging technologies. And the question, which I would think most of you have asked yourselves because you're interested in the area, is why is law so slow in answering and dealing with emerging technologies? Why do we make these really bad mistakes like Napster? Or why are judges making mistakes about interpreting technology or interpreting the law as applied to technology in people's minds? Lots of articles about that. So consider the possibility, and the coders among you will understand this. Technology is structuralist, and it's a language. So it's law that adapts to technology, not the other way around. So law is going to be slow because this generation of judges, or the next generation, or the generation after that actually, that grew up with the internet is going to have completely different interpretations of things than judges who grew up without the internet. Because technologies change how we relate to each other. Fundamentally, they are a language. So law and justice don't shape communications technologies. Communications technologies shape what law and justice are going to be. And there's no way to catch up. It takes time. So what are these parallels? So this is my version. I thought I'd be able to easily find two books, one on the history of media, one on the history of law, and just or the history of justice, and put them together. Wasn't that easy. There is now a book that tries to do it, so that's good. But this is from when I first did it. In pre-literate societies, before we had communications technologies, justice was retribution. If I wanted to kill you because I tripped over your foot, I could. Ridiculous, didn't make sense. With writing instruments, we got justice as compensation. It was interesting how the parallel happened, but suddenly we were able to track things and track things of value, and we started thinking of justice in a compensatory mode. With the printing press, this won't surprise you, printing press happens. What else happens? The French Revolution, not far after that. Well, Protestantism first, which is rights against Catholicism in a sense, and the French Revolution, justice as rights. Mass media and satellites, justice as truth. Digital, justice as resolution. Everything got so big and diffused when digital first came along. Can't we just all be friends? Can't we just resolve things? And resolution became and arbitration became a big thing in law. Big data, no surprise. Privacy, justice as boundaries. We need boundaries. And virtual reality, I've already talked about freedom of thought. These are not exclusive phases. You don't lose the previous phase, you just build on it. So I'm going to skip through this, but just know that the slides are here if you want to read them. Before justice was revenge. And retribution, believe it or not, an eye for an eye was a major step forward. because it introduced the concept of proportionality. It sounds horrible to us today, but it was actually a step forward. Writing instruments, we start getting actual laws being written and for the first time. And we're moving forwards to justice as rights. The Magna Carta doesn't do what people think it did. It basically just gave rights to the privileged, not to the people. But then that changed with the printing press, which also made the ability of decisions, of legal decisions, to be disseminated and therefore followed, and brought some standardization to the legal system. Then we get mass media, search for truth. What is true? We need to know what is true and what's a lie. And then digital, too much information, but nothing compared to big data, which is really too much information and is creepy, and therefore privacy and boundaries. And then virtual reality, we've already talked about. So what if the 8th technological meme is artificial intelligence? What from all that I said, you see how I'm doing on time, I'm doing okay. What will AI's influence on defining justice be? Let's give a couple of thoughts. Just a reminder that AI is tailored to individual wants, needs, and circumstances. In what I've been talking about, it's all about you as an individual. And we see that in our age, right? No two tattoos, or really no two people who have tattoos, are exactly the same. And why do people put tattoos on? Because they're trying to express their individuality through art and through creativity. YouTube is all about that. We have stars making millions of dollars, but not through the traditional media oligarchy, but in a totally different way. And it's successful. So, if AI was going to spin off a beam of justice for you, what would it be? Anybody have any ideas? This is a hard one, because it's completely counter to everything you believe about law and justice, probably. And you guys don't think about it on an everyday basis, nor should you. Anybody have any suggestions? Okay. Justice is personal. Everything in an AI world is personal. Can justice be personal? This is very, very hard. This is very hard. It's very counterintuitive for a bunch of reasons that I'm going to explain, and then we're going to wrap up. So it's essentially a question. But if everything in the emerging media world is getting more and more personal, why wouldn't justice be? If this is correct, it's completely at odds with our notions of equality. But be intellectually honest about the problem. When you go around campus, different people feel that justice is different things. Everyone feels aggrieved or satisfied by different things. Now, that's not a problem. The same issue could be a huge problem to someone else. It's always been, whether someone, and you can see this for hundreds of years in the justice system, whether someone feels that justice has been done has never been objective. It's always been subjective. But our cherished principle is that law should apply in the same way to everyone. So this is a very dangerous thought. And on a certain level, it doesn't have to be bad, because I particularly believe in equality and the rule of law. But is there a way to have tailored justice? Can we say, look, what's just for me is what I need. And it may not be the same as what's just for you. And that's okay. So what could that look like in the real world? This is extremely difficult, but here's an example in the copyright world. If you are a sharer of content, if you are not protective of your copyrights, then you get to share with other people who aren't protective of their copyrights. And you get to mod and build and have communities and do collaborations. But if you insist on your copyright rights strictly, then you don't get to use other people's stuff. Another kind of cherished issue is in arbitration, you have to use the rules of the law of the land. Well, what if the two parties having a dispute want to use anything? Flip a coin, set their own rules as to how something should be decided. What's the harm in that? I'm not talking about the courts, I'm talking about private arbitration. That's, again, tailored justice. There are dangers in going in this direction, and we see them in a couple of ways. We see them in a very benign way, and what it could be, and we see in China today implementations of what this actually can look like, and it's scary. The benign way is, you know, I love Gran Turismo Sport. It's kind of my game of choice these days. And what it does is it groups gamers. If you're a safe driver and a courteous driver, you will be in multiplayer races with other safe and courteous drivers. And all the mean, terrible crashers are all in some sort of hell with each other. That's not a problem for me. That seems appropriate. But, you know, China's implementing a social credit system. This is very dangerous. So that who you associate with on the internet can affect your ability to get a loan. If you're associating with the wrong people, you will not get into the right schools. This is the scary part of AI. The very scary part of AI. But it's very individually tailored. This is not mass. This is like right down to you. You're friends with that bad person. You're not going to get the loan. So last things. Think about, and I think we are the Emerging Media Lab, think about how AI can serve the uniquely personal. Are there ways that AI can actually be used, not just for good things like, you know, figuring out the difference between fake news and well-sourced news, but stuff that will make you grow. I like this. This was from Psychology Today. It's a regular column or a regular area of their website called Unique Like Everybody Else. And I think that captures the paradox, the essential paradox. Here's what I'm doing and what I hope to further through the Emerging Media Lab. In law, I doubt any of you have seen this movie. None of my law students have seen this movie because it's too old. It's a great movie called The Paper Chase. And it stars John Houseman as a Harvard law professor who uses the Socratic method. And the Socratic method isn't used very much these days, but the Socratic method is a way of, you see, in law, there's no right answer. Unlike in the sciences, where at least to a certain point, until you get to the highest level, there are right answers that you can scaffold off of. In law, there's always two sides of an argument, and your job as a lawyer is to come up with the best argument. And so what the Socratic method is a way of getting, is question and answer to get the student to probe more deeply into what possible answers might be. Problem with the Socratic method in the modern pedagogic idiom is that it's seen as abusive. And it can be abusive, and it can be subject of instructor bias and a whole bunch of things like that. So what if you could do something self-Socratic? What if you could use kind of an AI-ish structure so that students were essentially engaging in a dialogue with themselves, which by definition can't be abusive? And so working with that, on that, hopefully rolling something out in my video game law course on Tuesday, open website, so if you want to know more, you can go there. That's a very rudimentary thing, and I've expressed to Saeed the desire to do this in a more systematic way, hopefully with you guys. But that's AI. No two students who are going to engage in this are going to engage in it the same way at all. And that's not a bad thing. That's a really good thing. So just a couple of final things. Always be critical. I gave you some reasons to be critical. But is what I'm talking about so hopelessly Western because it's rooted in Western law? Also, is this too technologically deterministic? Am I saying that technology kind of runs everything? I think I'm actually saying the opposite. I'm actually saying that humanity is going to prevail here. And the last one, which is the one I'm really worried about, is saying that justice should be tailored shouldn't diminish equality before the law. So that's a really interesting, I've given some benign examples. There are some very dangerous examples. And what can be, the thing about technology and the reason the law looks at it as neutral is because it really can be used for good or bad. It's not the technology that's the fault. It's how it's used. So all of this is a matter of perspective. I think I have more or less been on time, so I thank you for that. And I'm happy to answer any questions or entertain any thoughts. I think we have 10 more scheduled minutes. But you may just all want to be in shock and